All right. You get to listen to me cough. Hopefully, not too much today. And we're going to dive in and talk about OSHA record keeping. Our goal today is really to help you understand about this compliance obligation that you may or may not have, and how to do it accurately. This at the end of the day, this is really a compliance obligation, and it's something that you that if we have to do it, we want to do it right, so we don't get citations. But it's something between us and OSHA, um, and it's something uh, that many of you may look at and say, well, this is just a pain, and it might be. But I think records are important, and it helps us to understand where our incidents are coming from and help us better manage those things. So um, every year at this time, we do this presentation because we have a ton of questions about OSHA record keeping, because there is an upcoming compliance date where you have to post your OSHA 300A summary, and that's on February 1st. And many people this time of year go, "Oh no, how do I do this?" And we end up with a lot of questions. And so this is a perennial topic that we put in front of you every year. Occasionally, there's some changes. There have been some fairly substantive changes in the last couple of years, and we'll go through each one of those things. But I'll tell you, it is something that we need, unless we're doing it on a regular basis. It's easy to forget how to do the kind of the nuances of OSHA record keeping. And truthfully, I went through and I watched my recording of this webinar from last year, and I'm like, wow, that was all right. And I learned a few things, or reminded myself of a few things in my own presentation from last year. So hopefully we can help you out today, to stay up on that. Brent and Doug, looks like Steve Hershey is having issues with sound. Could you help him out? um, let's see. So I threw this slide in just because it's going to help us to understand a few things as we discuss this, because there are two regulatory agencies that have to do with OSHA record keeping and reporting. There is federal OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that was created back in 1970 with the with the OSHA Act. That's federal OSHA when I talk about that. We also have the Utah Division of Occupational Safety and Health, or I'll call that Utah OSHA. Um, in the federal OSHA Act, um, they allowed individual states to run their own OSHA programs. And Utah applied for that. They applied actually fairly early on, and were given primacy is the word that they use. They are the ones that run the operations in the state. And so about at 1985 they had the fully approved program, and they run that. In general, they are enforcing the federal OSHA regulations. Some states have taken this primacy to a lot greater levels, a lot greater lengths. Cal OSHA has developed a giant number of regulations that are much more restrictive than the federal regulations. In Utah, we don't have very many of those extra regulations. Let's see. Doug and Brent, looks like Diane's having audio issues as well. But Diane Campbell, can you help her out, please? I don't know what our audio issues are going on, but we've had a few. So we have Utah OSHA has a few individual laws that are unique to the state, and we'll talk about at least one of those today. But in general, they are enforcing the federal OSHA standards for federal OSHA. You say, well, why is that? Why is that good? They get to when you have a state program, they have a little bit of leeway in adoption of those programs and how they're going to run the programs. and they can't do everything just exactly as they want. Their regulations need to be as at least as restrictive as the federal regulations, but they can go more restrictive. And I'll talk a little bit later about some things where Utah OSHA kind of kicked back on a federal OSHA requirement regarding record keeping, and specifically on electronic reporting. And federal OSHA put their foot down and said, no, you will do this. And so they were forced to do that. The feds always look at the feds always have that big stick where they can say, we'll cancel your state program. And so it's kind of a give and take there. It's good to have Utah OSHA. These are people that we can go downtown Salt Lake and sit down and have a talk with and say, hey, I don't agree with this citation that we were given, or we have some input on one thing or another, and there are people in our in our communities that we can actually talk with. And every year before I give this presentation, I talk with an OSHA rep and just ask about what their take is, our Utah OSHA rep, and talk about what their take is on things, and if anything is major has changed from the Utah OSHA standpoint. All right. So let's keep going. This guy here was probably the most active assistant secretary of federal OSHA that we've had for a long time. He's no longer in there. We have a new assistant secretary, but they haven't really put their elbows out much. But this guy, David Michaels, Dr. David Michaels, was the assistant secretary over OSHA during the Obama administration, and he pushed forward a lot of initiatives. And one of these was involving OSHA record keeping, and he talked about records. He says accurate records are not simply paperwork, but have an important, in fact, life-saving purpose. And while I might not agree with everything that Mr. Michaels pushed out, I do agree with this. And at the trust, we live and die by data. That's how we know. That's how we know how well you're doing, where your challenges may be, and so we do agree with having good record keeping. And so in that in the spirit of that thought, let's talk about OSHA record keeping. The actual OSHA standard is in 29 CFR 1904. Who is required to report under that? We'll talk about that in specificity on the next slide, but there are some exemptions. There are specific forms, the 300, the 300A summary, and the 301, which is the first report of injury. State of Utah, we call that a 122 form. They're the same form, has the same information on it. But there are specific forms required for this, and apologize, I was going to send all the forms out ahead of this presentation this morning, and then I had a couple of things come up and I didn't get those sent out, but I will send out sample forms that you can use to fill out your 300 log if you don't have that already. But after we get done with the presentation, I'll send that out to everybody that signed up. There is an upcoming posting requirement that I said on February 1st. We need to post our OSHA 300A summary, and that needs to stay up until April 30th. Where do I post that? Needs to be in an accessible location where employees can see it. Generally, you're going to post those up on a bulletin board outside the break room or something like that. Okay. In today's presentation, we're going to talk about compensable claims versus OSHA recordable claims. And we'll also talk about recordable claims versus reportable claims. And sometimes that can get a little bit confusing, and so hopefully we can clear that up for you. All right. Who is required to do OSHA record keeping? And just to, as we go into this, what are we record keeping about? It's about injuries and illnesses that occur in our workplace. And not everybody has to do this, including the trust. We're exempt, yay. But let's talk about how you have to fall into doing this type of record keeping. You are exempt if you have fewer than 10 full-time equivalent employees. What does that mean? That means that you have fewer than 10 fewer than 10 employees at any given time during a full-time employees um, during a calendar year. Now it's maybe a little less clear on there. What if I have 9 full-time employees and and we work overtime? We have quite a bit of overtime hours there. It's a full-time equivalent. So we look at the total number of hours worked. I could have 100% part-time employees and still fall into this 10 full-time employee equivalent based on the number of hours they work, because I've got 30 part-time employees that work half-time. Um, and so we got to take a look at that. How many employees do I have? When I talk to OSHA about that, they say basically you have to have 11. That's the point at which you're going to trip, falling under OSHA. Let me talk about oh, and then we have exempt workplaces. So based on the SIC code or the NAICS code, that's the North American Industrial Classification System. That is there are certain classifications that are exempt for this, and one of those involves insurance, and so the trust is exempted from this based on just the type of work that we do. So some workplaces are exempt. If you are exempt, you still have to report if you have a fatality that happens in your workplace. That's an obligation no matter what the size of your organization. We hope we never have to do that, but that's an obligation we have to do. And if you get a survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, these are things that come out every year, and they'll ask about the injuries and illnesses that happen in your workplace. You're still obligated by law to fill that out and return that to the BLS. Okay. Here's a list of those partially exempt industries. And so you look on here and you say, well, what's kind of the common thread here? What I would say is if your organization looks like an office, then you're probably going to be closer to one of these exempt organizations. There are things like gas stations that and retail organizations that fall into the exempt status. But for most of you out there, you don't get this exemption because you've got people doing, even though you may have a lot of office employees, you've got people that are out working in the street, fixing the roads, making sure the water's flowing, law enforcement agencies, firefighters. None of those are exempt from this based on the type of work that you're doing. One second. All right. So now we want to talk about the difference between OSHA recordable and workers' compensation claims, because there can be a difference in that. Just because you have a workers' compensation claim, that doesn't mean it is an OSHA recordable injury. Now, the definition of OSHA recordable is something that rises to a level that it would have to be recorded on your OSHA 300 log. So you may have somebody that goes to, they have a strain or something. Hey, I hurt my back, I hurt my shoulder or something like that. And they wanted to go to a doctor and see that. And the doc says, you're all right. Just, put some ice on it and you're fine. In those situations, there might be some medical costs that come from it that would rise to the level of a workers' compensation claim, but that would not be an OSHA recordable injury. So just simply calling up Doug or Brent or myself and saying, hey, can you give me a loss run for all of the work comp claims that I had in the last or in 2019, that that may not give you your list for your 300 log. You've got to go in and take a look at those and say, is this recordable or not? And that's the duty of the individual employer to make those determinations. We can definitely help you with that, but you have to decide if it's going to go on your 300 log or not. Could there be an injury that is not a workers' compensation claim that should be on the 300 log? Conceivably, yes, it could happen. We didn't, the the type of treatment that we did was free because we had a doctor on site or something, and the doctor did treatment and didn't charge us for it, and there wasn't a work comp claim for it. So technically, that could be a OSHA recordable claim that would need to be on your 300 log, but we don't have any idea it happened. And so it wouldn't be on a loss run for you. Okay? And it comes down, just remember that, it comes down to you as the employer to make that determination of whether it's recordable or not. All right. How do I get the information that's necessary for the OSHA 300 log? Well, we use the 300 or the 301 form, which is the first report of injury. And like I said, we have a corresponding form here in the state of Utah. It's the OSHA or it's the Utah form 122, and it's just known as the first report of injury. And it has all the information that you need to be able to file a workers' compensation claim, as well as the information necessary to fill out your 300 log. These 300 or these 122 forms or 301 forms need to be submitted to the Utah Labor Commission. And that's one thing. Utah OSHA is a division of the Utah Labor Commission. I should have said that earlier. They need to be sent to them within 7 calendar days. Before you panic too much on that, don't worry. If you submit a workers' compensation claim to the trust, we do that for you. Our adjusters will take that one. They fill out the 301 form, and that's submitted to the Labor Commission for you. Now, if you had something that didn't go through workers' compensation claim process, then you would be obligated to do that on your own. Here's an interesting sideline on this. Doctors also submit their own form for every work-related injury that they treat. And so at the Labor Commission, they will take the doctor's forms and they will take the employer's forms, and they'll look at the stacks and say, we've got a lot more from doctors than we do from this employer. We think maybe they're not submitting all of these things that happen. Sometimes people will go in to a doctor and say, hey, this is a work-related injury, when in fact it really isn't. And so they know they have to sort some of those out. And so, but a lot of times OSHA will go out and take a look at employers whose stacks don't line up. These don't really balance out, and they'll go and ask questions. All right. Question here is, so are there no specifics that determine if it's recordable? Yes, there are, Rob. And that's really the bulk of this presentation. You have to determine recordability, but I'm going to walk you through it and tell you exactly how we have to look at that. All right. So this is the 301 form. You don't have to use their specific forms. We just have to collect the same information. So we send out a form of our own, which is our first report of injury. It doesn't look anything like this, but it asks the same information that is on here. All right, so recordable injuries go on our 300 log. Then we have the issue of reportable. So recordable is just something I write down. I put this down on my 300 log, and it can be done electronically as well. Reportable injuries are serious injuries that must be called into Utah OSHA. So all reportable injuries are recordable. Okay, think about that for a second. So these are serious injuries. Anything that I've got to call OSHA and say, I had a fatality, I had somebody break their femur, I had somebody hospitalized for 3 days. Any of those things are are recordable as well as being reportable. But not all recordable injuries are reportable. So let's talk about that just for a second. Now, there are different levels. There's federal requirements for reporting and state requirements. As long as we're following the state requirements, we don't have to worry about the federal. But let's just look at those just briefly. OSHA changed this in just a few years ago. They said within 8 hours, I have to report all fatalities. Same requirement with the state of Utah. Within 24 hours, I have to report all inpatient hospitalizations, amputations, and losses of an eye. Okay? So those really fall into those serious type of injuries that need to be reported to OSHA. And in our state, that's Utah OSHA or UOSH. So in Utah, here's a number you may want to write down a note. And I can send out the slides on this, but I would write a note so you've got that available. Within 8 hours of the occurrence of all fatalities, disabling, significant, and serious injuries of illnesses, you got to call them and say, this happened. All right. And you say, what is disabling, significant, and serious? Well, that sounds fairly broad in the definition. And I've been through this and discussed this with representatives from OSHA. And unfortunately, I've made a few reports myself over my career for significant injuries that have happened. Here's the basics of it. If we look at those federal requirements of inpatient hospitalization, so that's not, I go to the ER. This is you are admitted to the hospital and you spend a night. Amputations, losses of an eye, those are pretty standard. Now, amputations, we say, okay, I get a chunk, I get my finger pinched and it takes a chunk of flesh off the tip of my finger. Is that an amputation? Generally, they're going to look at that as an avulsion. If it takes some bone, that's probably more of an amputation. If you want to, you can always lean on the conservative side and call about something if it's on the line. What's the risk of doing that? Well, the risk is that OSHA will come and visit you and they'll do an investigation on the incident that happened. And you can make that decision of if we want to do that. Having OSHA in your building is always a bit of a risk, just from a compliance standpoint. Not saying it's bad or anything like that, but it is a compliance risk to have them in. So you've got to make a determination. Do we have to do this? Okay, so let's go a little bit further in what is disabling, significant, and serious. Broken bones is something that Utah OSHA has explained to me falls into the category of disabling, significant, and serious. But there's some caveats on that. If I break my pinky, they don't want to hear about it. If I break my femur bone, right, a large bone in my leg, or I break my arm, break my leg, those types of things, those are reportable injuries. I have to call up and let Utah OSHA know that has occurred. Once again, hospitalizations. One thing that is also in this category is loss of consciousness. So somebody falls down and they're knocked unconscious. That's something that UOSH wants to hear about if you've had those types of significant injuries. Here's the bottom line on this. You can always give us a call, and we'll kind of be able to stand back and look at your situation and give you a little guidance there and say, yeah, I would definitely report this, or this one's on the line. I would probably lean towards reporting, because if you don't report, they're probably going to hear about it, and you might get a visit and a citation that comes from failure to report. Anyway, but we can run you through those lines of questions on there. Sometimes it'll be really easy and really clear, and we just say, yep, absolutely, report it, make sure you get it in within 8 hours. Sometimes it may not be so. And and if there's something that's really on the line, we can be there to actually talk to, I can call people in OSHA and say, hey, I have a friend who had this happen. Should they report this one? And whatever their take is, I can get back to you. So don't hesitate to call Doug, Brent, or myself, and we're happy to help walk you through those things. All right. Oh, I thought I'd just take a second right now to talk about OSHA posting requirements, just because we're going to be posting our 300 log and we're going to be by that bulletin board. Just remember that you have a bunch of obligations to post various labor law postings. You want to have those up on your bulletin board. Whoops, I thought I'm on the wrong slide. There we go. I'll go back to that one. So this is a good time of year, every time you go to put up your 300 log, just to take a look at those other labor law postings and ensure that you have everything current. They will be updated periodically. Some of you out there pay a subscription and they send you out a new poster every time something changes. That's fine. It costs some money to do that, and you can do it easily by going on to the website that I show here. You can actually just Google for Utah labor law postings, and if there's a site that comes up from the Labor Commission in Utah, it'll be this one that we see here, and it will have on one page every required labor law poster that you need to have posted, and you can just click on it and download a PDF, print it up, and put it up on your bulletin boards. It's a lot cheaper to do it that way, but it just relies on you to be doing that. And so I always use posting my 300A summary as the excuse to look at those posters. Okay. Anyway, just I wanted to get this. I hit this on the new requirements, and we'll go into this in detail at the end. There was an executive order about electronic requirement or reporting OSHA 300 log data. And it has gone into effect. The effective date was back in 2017. There are posting requirements. Utah and Utah OSHA specifically, for the first year of that, said, don't worry about it. As I talked with them, I read the requirements, said, oh, we've got to do this. And they said, don't worry about it. The Labor Commission receives all of those 122 forms. And so they said, we already have the data. We don't think we need to make more work for you in submitting this electronically. And so we went by that. And then things changed in October. Actually, it was the end of 2018 when federal OSHA put their foot down with Utah OSHA, and said, you need to require this. Anyway, we'll dive into that at the end of the presentation, but don't worry, we're in good shape. Okay, so let's get back to Rob's question here. What's recordable? We've got to decide if this injury is recordable or not. So let's run through the steps of determining if something is if an injury or an illness is recordable. So the first question we ask, did the employee experience an injury or an illness? Well, that's kind of the duh question, right? We're asking the question because they did have an injury and illness. So if they did, we say, is the injury or illness work related? That's an important question, because if it isn't, it's not going on the 300 log. Is the injury or illness a new case? If it is not a new case, it's something that this person was injured a year ago, but they had a re-aggravation of the case. We don't make a new addition to our 300 log. we go back and if the person loses time on their loses time or whatever, we'll update their previous the previous 300 log from a year before. Does the injury or illness meet the general recording criteria or the application to specific causes? Yes or no? And we'll talk about what the specific criteria is, because there's some details on that. All right, so what's the difference between an injury and an illness? I've been saying both of those things, and both of these can be excuse me, can be OSHA recordable. So an injury, that seems fairly straightforward. A cut, fracture, sprain, amputation, something like that. I'm injured. An illness can be something else. It can be acute, it can be chronic. So something like a lung disease. Let's hit this slide here. Recordable illnesses fall into these categories. A skin disorder, I get hives because I'm exposed to a certain chemical. I have a respiratory condition like asbestosis or silicosis or something like that that affects my lungs because of exposure to a chemical. Poisoning, hearing loss. There are other certain specific illnesses that fall into this category. Things like tuberculosis. Maybe you're working at a health department dealing with people who have tuberculosis and you contract the disease. This would be recordable on your OSHA 300 log. Other illnesses are not, something like the common cold or the flu. Even if I contract that from a coworker, those would not be OSHA recordable. There are just some very specific illnesses. Excuse me, hepatitis, and not the cough that I have. Hepatitis, if I contract hepatitis or HIV from exposure to somebody's blood or bodily fluids in the course of doing my work, that would be a recordable injury. All right, so recording. Right now we're looking at a little section of the 300 log, and we have to make some decisions here. Is it work related? Well, what does that mean? Is it a new case? Does it meet the OSHA criteria? So let's take a look here. A case is presumed work related if and only if an event or exposure in the work environment is a discernible cause of the injury or illness or of significant aggravation to a pre-existing condition. Okay, so it's got to be at work. It can't be not working. Okay, so if I'm traveling for work, but I'm on my own time, so I'm staying in a hotel and I slam my finger in the door or I slip and fall at the pool, that's not a work-related injury, even though I'm engaged in work-related travel. Okay, personal errands that I'm doing are also things that would be excluded from being a work-related injury. Recreation, fitness type injuries would not fall into this category as well. Eating, drinking, preparing your own food. So if you burn yourself with your coffee or cut yourself while you're preparing your food, those are not work-related injuries that would go on your 300 log. Grooming or taking personal meds. If I OD on my prescription, that is not something that would be recorded on the 300. If I have a motor vehicle accident in the parking lot or on my commute to or from work, that would not be an OSHA recordable injury. If I get if I get the cold or the flu, why do I always cough when I talk about that? Or mental illness doesn't fall into the category of OSHA recordable. So what is recordable? Some of these are easy. Death is really easy. If somebody dies in the course of doing their job, that is definitely a recordable injury. If they suffer days away from work, their injury is bad enough that they cannot go to work, that would be a recordable injury. If they have restricted work activity, the doctor takes a look at the type of job duties that they're doing and says, this employee can't do this part of the job, or they give specific restrictions that say they can only lift up to 5 pounds, or they can only do one armed work. So if their job is job duties take them outside of what those restrictions are, we have to move them to a different area or modify their duties, then that would be a recordable injury. If we have to transfer them to another department, another job, based on the injury that they have, the restrictions that they have, that would be recordable. Loss of consciousness is recordable. Significant illness or injury. What's significant? Yeah, I hate when they throw that kind of stuff out there. That's where we kind of have to use our best judgment. And then this is really the big decision that we're going to be making is medical treatment beyond first aid. Okay? So we all think back, we think and say, what's first aid? Most of us have a vision of what first aid is. It's, well, I slap a Band-Aid on. Okay? And a lot of that is that's absolutely correct. Is that Band-Aid is not going to be medical treatment beyond first aid. If I put ice on a strain, I can take ibuprofen or things like that to help with those things. That would not be an OSHA recordable. So let's talk about prescriptions and non-prescriptions, because there's some detail on that. If a doctor issues me a prescription for some medication, even if I don't use it, even if I don't fill that prescription, if the doctor issues the prescription, antibiotics, painkillers, things like that, anti-inflammatories, that becomes an OSHA recordable injury. If the doctor says, just take some ibuprofen and you'll be fine, just follow the label on the ibuprofen, that is not an OSHA recordable. However, if the doctor prescribes ibuprofen 800 milligrams, then that would be an OSHA recordable injury. The doctor writes the prescription for ibuprofen 800s, but says if you got ibuprofen there, just take 800 milligrams in a dose. But he wrote the prescription. That means it's an OSHA recordable. So we do have to be careful with that. And I've been known to have discussions with doctors on that and say, don't prescribe ibuprofen 800s if that's not necessary, because it changes it to an OSHA recordable injury, and our rates go up, our incident rates go up. Some other things that are first aid would be drilling a fingernail. You ever smashed your finger and black the nail? You get that big hematoma underneath there, and it hurts, and your finger throbs like crazy. Well, there's a treatment that you can do to that. They call it drilling. It's really more like taking a hot wire and melting a hole through your fingernail. Everybody's cringing right now. It actually doesn't hurt. And when you burn through that fingernail, it just opens a hole there. The pressure from the blood that's underneath that nail will release. And as I've done this over my career, it's just fun to watch people because they're freaked out because they don't want to have that. They don't want to have that drill going into their finger. But as soon as it releases the pressure, they just sigh, oh, because the pain is relieved. That is not an OSHA recordable. That would be a first aid claim. Cleaning, flushing, soaking wounds. So I have a cut and I take it to the sink and I wash it to get any dirt or debris out of there. If I take a pair of tweezers and I can pull a sliver out of my finger, those are all first aid. If I have to do surgical removal of an object or extra means to get something out of my eye, if I can just wash my eye because I've got an object in there, if I can take a Kleenex and just dab it and get that object out, that's first aid. But if there's surgical removal of an object, that would be. I worked in an industry where we use micro drill bits, and these things were super tiny. I mean, to the scale of a human hair, maybe twice that diameter. Really, really tiny things, drilling holes in circuit boards. And if you happen to brush up against these drill bits, they would easily penetrate your skin, and then they'd snap off. And they were so small that you couldn't see the drill bit to be able to remove the splinter. And they would have to surgically go in. They'd have an active X-ray when they were doing the surgery. So the doctor would actually watch the X-ray in real time to be able to extract that. That would be an OSHA recordable case. But if it's just a splinter, I can pull out with a pair of tweezers. That's first aid, and I don't have to put it on the 300 log. I have a cut if I get staples or sutures. I go to the doctor and he takes a little staple gun or puts stitches in. That is not first aid. It would be an OSHA recordable case. If I can just put a Band-Aid on it, even steri strips or butterfly bandages, they kind of changed that. Years ago, steri strips were recordable, and anymore they're first aid. So if I can reasonably be able to close that wound up with a butterfly bandage or a Band-Aid, we're in good shape. That one. Let's see. Excuse me. First aid, support devices. So we're talking about braces and things of that ilk. If it is a non-rigid support device, so kind of the elastic bandage that is not rigid, it doesn't have any solid metal or plastic stays in there that stops me from moving that part of my body, that is first aid. If it's a rigid splint, that is not first aid, and I'd have to record that. Now, sometimes somebody falls down and they hurt or do whatever to their knee, and it hurts, and the first responders come out and they put that individual into a rigid isolation splint just to get them to the doctor. If it's temporary isolation like that, just as a precautionary measure, that's first aid, and we don't have to record that injury. When we dive into the world of vaccinations, there's some nuance that goes into that. A tetanus vaccination is first aid, okay? And they just called that specifically out in the standard and said if you get a tetanus vaccination, that's just first aid. However, if I get a hepatitis vaccination, I got exposed to somebody's blood, and as a precaution, they gave me a hepatitis vaccination. That is actually a recordable injury. Hot or cold therapy is first aid. Physical therapy or chiropractic is not. There are a few nuances in that as well. If a physical therapist just sees you and gives you some advice, maybe they have a therapeutic massages done, something like that, that can be first aid. But if they're doing any sort of physical manipulation, chiropractic or physical therapy manipulation, that would be an OSHA recordable injury. Here's one. First aid is a needle stick. Is that first aid treatment, or is that a recordable? And in the standard, it says all needle sticks or punctures by sharps where someone is exposed to others' blood or potentially infectious material must be recorded as an injury on the 300 log. Whether there was any treatment that happened to that or not, if somebody's exposed through a needle stick, that you would have to record that. Now, just to differentiate that, if I work at a hypodermic needle factory and I'm working with the products and I poke myself with one of those needles that has never poked anybody else, that wouldn't fall into that category because it's not exposed to blood or other potentially infectious materials. Okay, it's just a sharp thing that I got poked with. All right, so let's run through. Boy, I've gone long. Sorry, guys. I'll blame it on coughing. So let's talk about how to complete the OSHA 300 log. I've got to put the recordable injuries on the log within 7 days of knowledge that the injury occurred. So after it's reported to me, the employee comes in, fills out the first report of injury. I got 7 days to get it on the log. So this is something that we should be doing ongoing, all the time. And what do I mean by that? I would just put a reminder on my calendar that the same day every week, I'm going to update my 300 log. So every Friday, my reminder pops up and says, update your 300 log. And I say, whew, we didn't have any injuries this week. I don't have to do anything on it. Great. And we hope that happens all year long. But otherwise, I'm going to go in and update all of that log, put the new injuries on, update if I have more lost time days for somebody that's been out. Okay. We want to update that as these cases mature or they change. Sometimes an injury will go from a medical only to a lost time type claim or case. And so we want to change its designation on this form. I need to maintain these logs for at least 5 years. And when OSHA comes to visit you, when they do a wall-to-wall inspection, they will want to see all of your 300 logs. So have those there and keep them up to date. These logs can be electronic or a hard copy. Hard copy is nice because you can handle it and you can hand it over to OSHA when they show up. But I much prefer the electronic copy. And when I send out the samples for you, I'll send both the PDF version as well as a Microsoft Excel version. I really like the Excel version because it actually updates your 300A summary automatically for you. That's really nice, and it's easier to update. I'm not erasing and changing stuff on that form as a case changes over time. I can just change it on the Excel spreadsheet. So that's what I would use, but it's totally up to you. You can use either one of those. So here's an example of what we're looking at on that, and I'm sure you can't see that very well. So we'll dive in and look at the specific sections there. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to record the case number. And what is that number? It's totally up to you. You could theoretically put on here the workers' compensation claim number. You could use that, or what I prefer to do is I put in, it needs to be unique to this case. I would always put on there the 2-digit last 2 numbers in the year, dash, and then depending on how many cases you're going to have, some zeros and if it's claim number 1. So for example, I would do for this year 20-001. If you're having under 100, I would just do that 01, and then the next one would be 20-02. Just needs to be a unique case number. We'll put on there the employee's name, their job title, the date of injury, when it occurred. Sometimes that's especially like with an illness, it's hard to really pin that down to exactly when that happened. But like for an illness, we could use the day that it was reported to us as the date of injury for that. Where the event occurred, and we want to be specific to this. The example they give in here, loading dock, north end. Put some detail on that. And then we need to describe the injury of illness, the body parts affected, and the objects or substances that directly injured or made the person ill. Okay? So I could say, well, the example they give is 2nd-degree burns on right forearm from acetylene torch. So when we look at that, that gives us all of the information that they're asking for. We want to say, what's the body part? What was the injury? And what caused it? And when I put the body part on there, it's important to put right or left. And so we can differentiate from one to another what has happened. And this is one that OSHA will get a little bit ticky-tack on if you haven't given enough detail on there. And truthfully, as I see claims come in to the trust, sometimes we're a little lazy on this. I'll see a claim that comes in for a workers compensation injury, and it said auto accident. Well, I have no idea what the injury was. I have no idea the body part. I have no idea how serious it is, because they didn't give the details. So just think about that. If I'm trying to describe an injury, I need to say what body part, what was the injury that happened, and what caused it. Okay. Then we follow this over to the other side of the page, and we classify it. Hopefully we don't ever have to check that first box for death, but if it is, we'll check it there. And then we've got a decision. Does this claim involve, or this case involve, days away from work? If it does, we'll check that box. If they remained at work, did they were they transferred, or did they have job restrictions? Or did they have work restrictions that didn't allow them to do a certain thing that affected their ability to do the job? Okay. And then the last one is other recordable cases. So if they had none of those other things, the other three, then we would just make it an other recordable case. From that point, we're going to move along, and we have to keep track of the days away from work and the transfer restricted duty days. Okay, that's probably the most complicated and biggest pain of keeping your 300 log, is keeping track of those days. And then the next box is check the injury column, or choose one type of illness. So if it's an injury, a cut, strain, those types of things, just check the injury box. And then if it's an illness, then I've got one of those 5 different categories. I always cough when I say illness: skin disorder, respiratory, poisoning, hearing loss, or all other illnesses. And we just decide that, and we put a check box. Check the box. Okay, covered all that. Sorry, I talked when and over that. Just on counting our days away from work, we don't count the day of the injury, because they were at work that day when that happened. We're going to count calendar days. Okay, not the specified shifts that they were supposed to be at work. It's starting on the next day after the injury occurred. If they cannot come to work because the doctor says that they can't come to work, then I'll start counting at that point, and it's going to be a calendar day. If I reach 180 days, I can stop. That's a bad injury, and they give us kind of that end point that if I hit 180 days, I'm done, and I can stop keeping track of it. If an employee quits their job on their own, I can also quit at that point, tracking those days. Job transfer or restrictions. That's one thing. If we're responsible to keep this log, I got to stay on top of it and make sure that the employee is getting their restrictions back from the doctors and to me, so I know when they go on restrictions and when those restrictions are removed, so I can keep track of those days. Once again, calendar days. Let's see. Other recordable cases are just those ones that they don't have lost time or restricted duty. All right, so our 300A summary, this is what we're going to have to post here in just a couple of weeks on February 1st. We don't post our 300 log because that has personal information that we don't want the general public to have access to. We don't want to post names and the specifics of the injuries. What we do post is a summary of everything that happens, and that's the 300A log. Like I said, if you use the Microsoft Excel version of the 300 log, it will automatically be filled in for you. And so you just click on it on the 300A tab at the bottom of the spreadsheet. I guess it's the bottom, depends on what version you're using. And then you can print it up from there. So in this section, we count up the totals from each of those lines from each of the injuries. Just a reminder on that. Where do I post it? A public location, not necessarily for the general public, but where employees can see it. So I would go. A lot of you have your labor law bulletin or labor law poster bulletin board somewhere near the employee break room. I would post it in a place like that so it's visible. But once again, we don't post the personal information, just the 300A stuff. There is a certification on this that the chief executive officer needs to sign that says it's all true and correct and all that stuff. Okay. Over here on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the establishment information. We'll put in the name of your organization, the address, industry description, what are you doing, the standard industrial classification, the SIC code or the NAICS code, and you can look those up online. If you got a question about that, give me a call on chasing that down. How the annual average number of employees and the total hours worked by all employees last year. So in the year 2019 that we're just going to report on. Why is that important? Well, that helps us develop our rates. And so when OSHA comes in to visit you and they want to see your 300A data, that's part of what they're doing is they'll look at your rates. And then the designated felon in your organization, the chief executive officer, whoever's the boss, will sign this to certify that the information is all correct. Okay. What numbers do we have in there? Just those numbers from the individual 300 log. We just count up how many of each one of those things that we have. The total number of deaths, the total number of days of cases with days away from work, the total number of cases with restricted, other cases, illnesses, all that kind of stuff. Okay. I've gone long, so I'm going quickly. There's some other cases. If we have a work-related hearing loss, those are a little tricky. Call us on that, and we'll help walk you through that. Medical removal if they're required to be taken out of a job. A lot of these come from specific standards as far as like lead exposure or certain illnesses that are required by OSHA to be removed from that. Then talk to us on that. We'll help you through that. Tuberculosis, somebody develops tuberculosis, part of that. That's one that needs to be put on that log. But there's also some other specific requirements. So if you ever have one of those, give us a call and we'll walk you through that. Privacy cases. There are certain cases that we don't put on our 300 log. We'll have a separate log for these type of cases. Those are things involving people's private parts if they get injured there, or if they contract HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, something like that. They're a victim of sexual assault in the workplace. Those types of things are not put onto that case. Mental illness, another one that wouldn't be there. Needle sticks were contaminated with person's blood or other materials. This is a separate log that we'll keep for these types of cases. Sometimes people will request to not have their individual case on that 300 log, and so we can put that on the privacy case log, and we keep that under tighter control. Just a couple of important things. When we looked on there, it said the establishment. Establishment's an important term in here. I need to have a separate 300 log for each establishment. Say, well, what's that? Is it just my organization? And it may be, but it depends. If I have a separate establishment, so that could really be a building. Let's say I'm in a city organization, and I have, I'm looking across the street here to North Salt Lake City. They have the city hall, here, and most of their office type functions are done out of the city hall. The police department's out of there, but they also have a parks department that's actually probably close to a mile away from city hall. Public works is a little further away. um, those would be individual established. Actually, I think for them, I think that their public works and parks are in the same establishment, but they could not have the same 300 log for the city hall as the public works department. And this is one that OSHA has really hit a lot of our local government agencies on, because they didn't have a separate log for each establishment. They just had one for everybody. It's a bit of a pain, um, but that's what the requirement says. So you want to have one for each establishment. You want to record those cases within 7 calendar days. Review, certify, and post our 300A by February 1st. Keep those forms for 5 years. Keep them in a location where you can find those. Update those as we go along. I don't update the 300 to the 301 or the 300A once I've made that determination and posted the 300A for the year. I just go with that, but I can go back and update those cases if they continue on. And one part of the OSHA requirement is to provide employee access. If they want to see their individual claim on the 300 log and see how it's recorded, we need to provide them access. And there's a certain time amount that we can tell them that all right, that's great, we got your request, come in tomorrow. And so you can make sure those are up to date, and that we can shield other people's information so they only see their own individual claim. All right, so managing your 300 log. A few things that we can do out there. Talk to your medical providers on there. We don't want to have OSHA recordable cases on our log because, well, we don't want those type of cases. But if I can manage those, that gets me that makes it less likely that OSHA is just going to show up because I have a high incident rate. So those types of things of hey doc, what are you doing? What are you doing on this or that? Giving somebody time off just because it feels good to give them some time off, when it's really not that significant of an injury. Let them know that you accommodate restrictions, that you have light duty jobs, and you'll do what it takes to get the person back to work. Prescriptions, same things. Provide first aid. Train your people on doing that. Many of these injuries can be handled. If it's just a first aid, they can be handled at the work site. And there are things that you don't have to necessarily go to a medical provider if it's just a Band-Aid case. If it's something that, oh man, I strained my shoulder a little bit. Sometimes we can work on doing that first aid, put some ice on it, and then tomorrow or next week, if it's still bothering me, then we'll look at going to the doctor. And if somebody needs to go to the doctor, we definitely get them there. A lot of these cases that are really just simple first aid, we can handle there and keep those off of our 300 log. One really important part is if you're that workers' compensation coordinator, you need to be involved with those cases and work on those on a regular basis and know what they're doing. Keep track of those lost time days. And like I said, there are many times when a doctor is giving lost time days that they don't need to do. And if we can talk to the doc and get that employee back to work, not only does it keep it off our 300 log, it's going to save us a ton of money in the long run, because those are the claims that really have a hit on your EMOD and your workers' compensation premium. So we'd love to discuss that with you and talk you through those things. One other document that I'll send out is a workers' comp claim milestone. This is just a simple log, but it's a way that you can track if we have a case come in that is restricted duty, or we have a case that is a lost time, or really anything that's on workers' compensation, this is just a summary of everything that's happened in the claim. We may end up sometimes with a more complicated case. We may end up with a stack of paperwork. It's really nice to have an overall summary, and I can see the date at which this person went out on lost time, or the date that their restrictions start, and it just makes it much easier to do this. So I'll send that out with the materials as we send all that stuff out. Okay, OSHA record keeping and reporting. I told you that OSHA came up with a requirement to electronically report your 300 data, that you would have to go online and put all that information in there. Then I said that Utah OSHA said, we don't need the data, we already have it, don't worry about it. And then federal OSHA came back to Utah OSHA, UOSH, and said, in the words of the OSHA person that I talked to, they put a gun to our head and said, you have to do this. And so in Utah, you do have to do that. There are only certain industries that are required to do that, or certain sizes of organizations. Let me give you this, just the quick and dirty, because I am already way over time. I apologize for that, folks. We're now required to do that reporting in the state if we fall into certain categories. So here's some categories: establishments with over 250 employees. How many of our organizations around the state have over 250 employees in one establishment? There are some, but it's not a giant number there. If you have between 25 and 250 employees, there are only certain industries. And don't get worried about it. I'm going to go through these fast, because I'm going to let you off the hook here in a second. Some of these look like they might involve members of the trust, waste collection, waste treatment and disposal, those types of things. These are the industries. Don't freak out, because I'm going to let you off the hook. Here's the deal. At a federal level, federal OSHA does not regulate federal or state and local entities. And Utah OSHA, but in Utah, they actually do regulate local, state, and local entities. But Utah OSHA doesn't care. They don't want this information. So under federal OSHA, we are exempt from this electronic reporting. So you don't have to do this electronic reporting, because if federal OSHA came in and said, hey, where is this, we'd say, get out of here. We are not regulated under federal OSHA, and Utah OSHA does not want the information. They've already got it through the Labor Commission, through our already required reporting. So just for information's sake, the electronic reporting went online January 2nd, 2019, and there are ways to do that, but I'm not going to spend any time on that. You can go on the Utah or on the federal OSHA website to look at what that information is. All right, just in summary, keep your forms up to date. And keep the forms. Got to keep those for 5 years. Keep them in a place that you can find them. Don't mess it up by having return to duty forms from individual employees in there. Have it in a separate folder. Have it on your computer, just so it's taken care of if OSHA does happen to show up. You guys can do this. It's a little confusing, but it's definitely something that we just have to go on and work on it, make it work. Okay, folks, if you have any questions, please type those into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will answer those now. I'm looking here. Do we count subcontractors that work out of our facility? And the answer to that is no. These are employees. Now, there is a caveat to that. Many of you have volunteers that work for your organization, and under the definition, they probably fall into the category of an employee. I would record those volunteers just because of the definition of volunteer under state statute. So if I had type of an injury, I've got a volunteer firefighter, I've got search and rescue person, something like that, I would record those. I would record those injuries. But contractors, no, they're working for a different company, and so they would be recording their own injuries on their 300 log. Let's see. Question: if the PowerPoint is available, and yes, I will send out the slides from this along with the individual forms, the 300 forms, and the other one, oh, it was the workers' compensation claim milestone sheet. I think that was all the forms that I'll send out. But I'll send that out to everybody that signed up for the webinar. And just on that note, if you see one of our webinars that you really like the subject, but you can't attend live, sign up anyway. That lets us know that you're into that subject, and that helps us determine what type of subjects that we do webinars on. But it also will get you in the distribution list. So if I'm sending out forms, or I'm sending out slides, or just when the webinar recording is available on our website, you'll get that. So sign up whether you can attend or not. Let's see. Any other questions? Doug, Brent, anything that I missed or something I need to clarify? Or
I think you got it covered. Good job, Jason.
Thanks, Brent. All right. Thank you very much for your time. I apologize for going. Wow, I really went long. I'm blaming it all. I'm blaming it all on my cough, because I was trying to not cough too much. Thank you so much for all of your efforts out there. Please do not hesitate to call me, call Doug, call Brent, and we can walk you through specific questions on this subject, and encourage you to really get involved with this. Not only can we meet compliance obligations, but if you're more involved with work comp claims, they will have better outcomes, and your employees will be healthier, or will get healthier quicker. They will get well, and in the long run, you're going to save money on premiums and all of that stuff. So you are a key critical element in making these things better. So thank you so much. Be safe out there. Have a great day.